perfect government to the rule of Christ when he returns. And so it's this wonderful celebratory event that takes place when the kingdoms of this world become the kingdoms of our Christ, and he will reign forever and ever. And so our despair is not at all total, it's merely temporary, that we long for a better ruler, a son of David, who will not take but will give and give and give, and we long for that governance by him in the life to come. We want to chat some about the lengthiest passage that addresses civil government in the New Testament, and that is Romans 13. There are a few brief passages, as in 1 Peter, to give respect to the emperor, to honor the rulers, and so forth. So you have these little brief ones, but Romans 13 is the lengthiest passage in its 7 verses that deal with the magistrate. You'll note, however, that I begin the discussion with Romans 12, 14 through 21. And I do this because I've been persuaded by Jacques Ellul that Paul is intentional about the context. So the context in which he discusses the Roman magistrate in the first century is his bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them. Never avenge yourselves, leave it to the wrath of God. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. You will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. That's the non-neutral context in which he then says, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. They are among the enemies that we pray for. They are among the evil that we try not to be overcome by. They are among those upon whose heads we heap burning coal. They are among those whom we wish to avenge ourselves, and God says, don't. That is to say, writing to a Jewish Christian audience. Christians now persecuted even more than the Jews by the Romans. Paul takes a deep breath before urging submission to the governing authorities by being candid about the fact that these people are out to get us. Right? So it's not a very rosy picture, but I think the picture is potentially more rosy without Romans 12 than it is with Romans 12. In the context following Romans 12, Jacques Ellul says, Paul waits until he's given instructions on what to do with your enemies and your persecutors and those whom you're tempted to have vengeance upon. And in that context, he talks about the magistrate there. So let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Now, you will occasionally hear this as let everyone obey the governing authorities, and it does not say that. Both in Greek and in English, obey and submit are different verbs. And Paul uses both in Ephesians 5:21 through 6:3. Hupata somenoi, being submissive to one another out of the fear of Christ, wives to your husbands as to Christ, and so forth. But then to children, obey your parents. He does not say be submissive to your parents, but children, obey your parents. So he uses both verbs in the same passage there at the conclusion of Ephesians 5 as it leaks over into Ephesians 6. By the way, those are our numbers. They aren't Paul's. He wouldn't have done that. It's a mild mistake. But Paul knows how to say obey when he wants to, and he knows how to say be subject to when he wants to, and he's capable of doing either. And both in English and in Greek, there's a distinction. To submit to something is to acknowledge its jurisdiction and to cooperate with its exercise of its lawful authority. It does not mean you agree with it. It does not mean you offer it every obedience requested. So you may recall that the apostles early on in Jerusalem, even before the church had spread beyond to Judea, Samaria, or the ends of the earth, even in Jerusalem, the authorities told them that that was causing a bit of an uproar here and to stop preaching. And the apostles said, whether it is right before God to obey you rather than God, krenete, you decide. As for us, we can only continue to preach the word of God. Now notice by saying krenete, you decide, they acknowledge the jurisdiction of the magistrate here. You determine, we are in your jurisdiction, under your governance, and you may choose to fine us or incarcerate us, imprison us or something like that. You do what you have to do, we understand. But we have to do this. So they plainly did not offer the obedience requested. They continued to preach. And yet at the same time, they were submissive to the jurisdiction of the magistrate. They recognized he had jurisdiction over the matter to hear it, and they said, you hear it. You decide it. We understand. You've got to do your thing. We've got to do our thing. And you decide what to do. You see this later after the Apostle Paul is called, and he's out there preaching, and they have the same problem with Paul, and they actually decide to jail him at Philippi for preaching. And while he's in jail, he preaches to the Philippian jailer who converts, and he baptizes his family. So it's kind of an interesting thing. That they throw him in jail for preaching, and he preaches to the jailer while he's in jail. So he plainly disobeys, but he also submits. And the apostles disobeyed, but were submissive. They acknowledged the authority of the magistrates there to determine the matter. And they even said, you decide. You judge it. That's in God's providence. It's fallen upon you to decide these cases. You decide it. But we will, of course, continue to preach. And so when Paul says, be subject to the governing authority, he's saying anarchy is just not a Christian option. Living without jurisdiction and government is simply not a Christian option. We do not have the liberty, after Genesis 9, to live without some magistrate governing the culture and trying to prevent the wicked from overtaking it. And so that's what he says. But then note the for that begins verse 1b, and there's a big gap in there, isn't it? That's purposely on my part to leave room for the notes. For there is no authority. And then in verse 3, for rulers are not a terror. Both of those fors are there in the original text. And they are not inconsequential. I think that Sproul has said he learned from his mentor, Dr. Gerstner, that when you see a for or a therefore in the biblical passage, ask what the for or the therefore is there for. Now, you can't say that early in the morning without a few cups of coffee in you, right? It's probably hazardous at any moment, but I think you get the point. What you actually have then is an imperative with a ground. Be submissive for this reason. Now, you see what's going to happen logically. If you take away the ground, then you've taken away the ground. And so underneath the imperative, be submissive, you have a reason for why they are to be submissive. And then under that, you have a reason for the reason. And so it goes this way. Be submissive, for God has instituted the magistrate, for the magistrate's duty is to punish the wicked. That's in short scope what happens in Romans 13, 1 through 7. Submit to the magistrate, for God has instituted the magistrate for the purpose of punishing the wicked. So it's as though you have two carpets underneath your feet. And the feet is be submissive to the magistrate. But you can pull that carpet out from underneath the feet, and underneath that carpet is another carpet, and you could pull that carpet out. So there's two ways that you could pull out from underneath your feet the duty to be submissive to the magistrate. And so he acknowledges that God has instituted civil governance. Many interpreters, I think the majority who raise the question, answer it this way, that Paul's simply commenting on Genesis 9. This is just his unpacking the Genesis 9 passage that we looked at last evening, that the magistrate is instituted by God. It is God who institutes the magistrate. And you'll note in verse 3, he's to be a terror to good conduct. Does that not recall that the dread and fear of you will be upon all the creatures and so forth? Of course, this is the language of Genesis that's being spoken of. He doesn't wield the sword in vain. By man shall his blood be shed. The parallels between Genesis 9 and Romans 13, for someone like Paul, trained with rabbis to know the Holy Scriptures, and especially Genesis, it's virtually impossible, I think, certainly unlikely, that he is not aware that what he's doing to these Christians is saying, the same magistrate that God instituted in Genesis 9 long before he called Father Abraham was given to God for the benefit of the human race, not just for the children of Abraham. And therefore, now that the new covenant is here, open to Gentiles like you at Rome, you do not have to submit to Mosaic ordinances, but of course you have to submit to creation ordinances, those things that God instituted before he ever called Father Abraham, whose son you were not. You are all Romans. You are largely Gentiles. Nonetheless, God instituted this for the good of the human race, not just for the good of the children of Abraham. So it looks like that's what he's doing. So when he says there's no authority except from God, those that exist have been instituted by God. Whoever resists, therefore, these authorities resists what God has appointed. and those who resist will incur judgment. If God says, if a man takes a man's life, by man shall his blood be shed, then God has instituted this reality, and to reject that reality is to reject God's institution. And so whatever we personally think about it, Paul says, God has instituted this. Is it a fear and a dread and a terror? Yes. But it is what God has instituted, and so it is there. But then in 3 through 7, the rubber begins to hit the road, because Paul describes why God instituted the magistrate, right? Submit to the magistrate because God instituted it. But why would God institute a thing unless he has a purpose for it? And so then he gives us the purpose, that he is not a terror to good conduct, but to evil. Terror, again, right? By man shall his blood be shed. And it says, does not wield the sword in vain. Paul is perfectly aware that he's talking about this institution that has the power to inflict censures on the wicked, even to the highest censure, capital punishment. He's a terror. We're not terrified by the person taking away our right to visit New Jersey once a year. Who wants to visit New Jersey once a year anyway, right? It's not the lesser punishments that concern us. It's the graver punishments, incarceration and capital punishment, that disturb us, of course. And so Paul cuts right to that, of course. So, would you have no fear of the one who's in authority? Fear and dread. Don't want the fear? Then do what's good. You'll receive his approval. He's God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. He does not bear the sword in vain. He is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out wrath on the wrongdoer. God's is not in the original text. Feel free to circle or underscore that. It says, for he carries out wrath on the wrongdoer. I think it's his own wrath. I don't think it's God's. And I think the ESV insertion of God's here is gratuitous. It's just not in the Greek text. It just says he carries out wrath on the wrongdoer. And therefore one must be in subjection not only to avoid, and again, the text says to avoid wrath. It doesn't say God's wrath. To avoid wrath, I take it to be the emperor's wrath we're concerned about. In other words, God's wrath in the age to come we'll deal with in the age to come. Now it's this guy who's got the sword. It's his anger I'm concerned about, not God's at that point. So in both of those places, God's is added to the text. It isn't there. Which is, by the way, odd for the ESV to do that. They say literal where possible. And I use the ESV publicly. I think it's a very, very good translation. But you could have been literal here and just left it ambiguous as to whose wrath is being spoken of. You could have said his wrath. We wouldn't know if the antecedent of his is the emperor or God. They decided the question by inserting God into the text. And I don't see any reason that they had to do that. I don't object to people who interpret it that way. But there's a distinction between a translation and an interpretation. And I'd rather keep the interpretation out of the translation if possible. So I wish they just said wrath and let us wrestle with whose it is. So we have to be in subjection not only to avoid wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. Now he mentions conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities or ministers of God attending this thing. Pay to all what is owed them. I think he's aware of Jesus. He'll even open the question is what is owed. And so taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Whether this Roman governor deserves much honor, I don't know. Whether he deserves any respect, how much taxes, I don't know. He's probably following Jesus here. And this is a clever little way of feigning a certain kind of compliance, enough that you can't get in trouble, and let people do what they want with it, sort of a thing. But now, you'll note that Manton, the old Puritan from the 17th century, in his epistle on James, refers to this passage. And he says that Paul mentions two grounds for submission. A principial ground, insofar as the civil magistrate is instituted by God to promote good behavior. Your conscience tells you you ought to do what he says. If he rewards good behavior and punishes evil behavior, conscience itself says you should do what is good and avoid what is evil. But insofar as he doesn't bear the sword in vain, you have a prudential consideration, Manton said. Suppose what he requires of you is not inherently good, or what he prohibits is not inherently evil. Then your only consideration is the likelihood that he will catch you and the severity of his punishment. So suppose he simply required that all Roman citizens once a year planted a cedar tree, a little sapling. And suppose you could buy them at the equivalent of a Walmart for 79 cents in the first century. Well, what harm could be done by planting a cedar? It's not an onerous burden, right? It's not like planting a forest of cedars that would cost you thousands of dollars and much time. And it's not really offensive. It's not plant one and dedicate it to Zeus, right? There's no polytheism involved, false religion. Sort of a stupid thing for the emperor to require us to do. It's not inherently morally right to plant a cedar or not to plant a cedar. But if he's going to put you in prison for a year if you don't plant a cedar, you'd probably calculate, say, well, not carry the knot. Jethro helps. Not carry the knot. Probably better to plant the cedar than to go to jail, right? So when I filled out the paperwork when our girls were homeschooled in New Hampshire and later the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, I didn't think the state, I don't believe in compulsory education. I think it's mistaken policy. It's the policy of Plato's Republic. And it thinks that the state is God and that the children belong to God rather than the parents. And it's an abhorrent idea, in my opinion. But we were required to fill out paperwork with our lesson plans for the year, what we plan to do and accomplish in the year, and at the end of the year required to have someone evaluate whether we had done that or not. And I filled out the paperwork. Why? I thought the state had no authority to raise the question or to ask me to fill out paperwork. I'd rather spend one night doing paperwork than 1 week in the slammer. Just add it up. Even a Greek professor can do the math. 2 hours of paperwork is better than 2 weeks in jail, right? So I don't think there's anything morally obligatory that any parent should have to explain to anyone else on the planet how you're educating your children. So I don't think it's morally malfeasant not to do so. On the other hand, he doesn't bear the sword in vain. So there was no conscientious reason to do this because I don't think they had any authority to compel education anyway, or any authority to compel that I do it in a certain way. The legislators in Pennsylvania do not have 4 degrees. I do. They have no experience teaching. I've been teaching since 1981. They don't know my daughters well. I've known them since the day of their birth. Who are they to tell me how to rear them? Right? It's one of those funny questions where to raise it, you'd say, who on earth are they to demand that I give them an account for how I'm educating my daughters? It's a silly thing, right? So it's silly, but on the other hand, it's not immoral to fill out paperwork, right? So it's not a moral duty to fill out paperwork, and it's not immoral to fill out paperwork. It's just one of those things that's neutral. But he doesn't wield the sword in vain, and Manton says, insofar as he does what God requires of them, he would only punish wicked behavior, not good behavior, or even neutral behavior. And insofar as he does what God is to do, he would always reward good behavior, and not evil behavior, and not neutral behavior, but good behavior. But if he, being what they are since 1 Samuel 8, if he steps out of the role God has assigned him, then you still have the consideration of the fact that he doesn't wield the sword in vain. You have a prudential consideration. So if he does what he's instituted by God to do, punishes evil, requires what is good, and rewards it, conscience itself says you should do those things even if there were no magistrate, because we should do what is good and evade what is evil. And if he steps out of that arena into an arena where he has no just authority, he does not thereby lose his sword suddenly. And there you have to raise the prudential question of whether you would not offer him his obedience simply because it's better than the alternative. And so Manton says it would be evil if Paul raised the question of expedience if we had a conscientious duty to follow him always. Because the martyrs knew that he didn't bear the sword in vain, and they suffered martyrdom. So Manton says what Paul must do here is introduce 2 different considerations. The conscientious consideration to obey the one who's the minister of God's good for you, who rewards what is good and punishes what is evil. Conscience says we should obey that. But then other considerations might cause us to obey him even if he has stepped out of the arena that God has assigned him. And once he steps out of that arena to another arena altogether, the for disappears and the therefore disappears, and therefore there is no for that says we have to do what the text says we have to do. And so this view of Manton has been around for many, many years. I take it to be the view of Charles Hodge, who said that any criminal law that is not grounded in morality is a nullity. And I think he knew what the doctrine of nullification meant in the 19th century and was quite intentional about it, that a moral law has no force if it is not grounded in moral law. And so that seemed to be his understanding as well. It was the understanding of many people in the 19th century. Once the American WASP had the tools of power in the United States for a century or more, people tended to view Romans 13 as though it's always our duty to be good law-abiding citizens. When I was a child, the expression law-abiding citizen was a term of approval. He's a law-abiding citizen. It meant he's a good person. Now that Christians have increasingly lost control of the governmental authority, many Christians are rethinking the issue, right? And so 20 years ago I was saying, eventually people will think my view isn't kooky, partly because I got it from Manton and Hodge and from Paul, by the way, but also because you only think otherwise because right now you've been reared in a culture where white Anglo-Saxon Protestants have pretty much run things the way a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant wants them to. And so you think compliance with such is good. But what happens when other peoples are exercising power and not, in fact, doing the kinds of things you want? Then you're going to love Manton's view and Hodge's view and my view of the Apostle Paul's teaching, because you will realize then that the conscientious issue disappears when he steps out of his role. And therefore, when he steps out of his role, the only question is the prudential consideration. Will he likely catch me, and will the punishment be severe? And so I've been smoking Cuban cigars off and on for 20 years. And I stop every now and then to sleep or take a nap. People say, do you always smoke cigars? I said, oh no, only when I'm awake. So they're about to become legal. You see, this is going to baffle everyone because I'm going to say, look, I've been smoking them for 23 years when they were a violation of federal law. Are they suddenly going to become morally virtuous because Obama's changed our policy towards Cuba? Right? Were they inherently wrong before and inherently right now? Or were they always a neutral matter and the government should have just never had a hand in it? Right? And so in that case, I just realized they're not very likely to catch me. 3 times I've had my shipments from Nicosia be opened and inspected by customs, and they come through. And also Ronnie, from whom I purchased them, says that if you lose the shipment, I'll credit your credit card back. So I have nothing to lose. And so to me, what in the world is he doing? All of your Nicaraguan cigars are grown in Nicaraguan soil, but with Cuban seed. All Dominican and Honduran cigars are raised with Cuban seed. They take the seed because it's the best tobacco seed in the world, and they plant it in different soils. Is one soil sinful? Right? If you brought an aircraft carrier soiled back from the Vuelta Baja region of Cuba and dumped it in Nicaragua and smoked those cigars, would they still be sinful or no longer sinful? Right? And the point is, it's sort of a silly thing for the government to ever been involved in such things. And so I never paid much attention to it because the government's authority was abolished as soon as you started doing this kind of thing. So then the only question is, how likely was I to get caught, and what would it cost me? And I wouldn't have lectured about it publicly for 20 years if I had any grave fear of being caught. Now, I didn't tell you Ronnie's last name or the name of his firm in Cyprus. Right. Now, you can send Jim Rockford out there and try to figure it all out for yourself if you can. But he's pretty clever, and I think he knows how to do this so he's not caught. It's a trivial example of the homeschooling thing being a more significant example, and that is to say, the magistrate is not instituted by God to insert his own will upon his people. It's to enforce God's will, to reward what is good, as God describes it, and to punish what is evil, as God describes it. And when he uses the authority God has given him for that high and noble purpose, to simply do whatever he wishes, he loses and forsakes any conscientious obligation to obey him. All we have left then is the prudential consideration: are we likely to get caught? And are we willing to suffer the consequences? Now, I kind of crept my way, into Cuban cigar smoking. When my friend Dean, who was a brewer in New Hampshire, went to the British Isles once, he said, "If I can get us some Cubans, would you split a box?" I said, "Yes." Get us a box of Bully No. 1s. And so I gave him some money up front. When he came back, he had just put them in his backpack in the box that said Bolivar, Belicoso, Havana, and Customs took them. Right. And so Dean came back cigarless. And I said, "Dean, you could have been a little craftier. Take the bands off, maybe take a Macanudo box over there and put them in a Macanudo box," something like this. So we lost them, but I also realized they didn't fine him. They didn't do anything but confiscate them. Right. So he lost $160 or $180, but he didn't lose anything else. So we knew then that they weren't prosecuting any people anymore for this sort of silly law. They were just confiscating them. And in fact, by the way, I shortly thereafter volunteered through a friend who worked for the federal government to volunteer my labor on behalf of the federal government in one of its departments. And he said, "Which one?" I said, "Customs." He said, "What would you like to do?" I said, "Well, when they confiscate items from people in the airports, I would like to destroy them by fire slowly, one by one." Oddly enough, I had no takers in the federal government for my largesse, but I was more than willing to commit these cigars one by one to the flame and to protect our culture thereby from their apparent wickedness by destroying them. I thought it was a great idea. Save money, right? Let me destroy them instead of them destroying them. No takers. So that's where we ended up. So for us then, the magistrate is instituted by God. That's the ground of our submission to it. But God institutes him for a purpose, not for any purpose. And that's the rug underneath the rug. And so if you're going to use the first rug, but God instituted the government, it's grounds for our submission to him. Say, but then you have to put the second rug under there that Paul puts in there because God has a purpose for it. And insofar as he steps outside of the divine purpose, the rug comes out, including the rug on top of it, and now our feet are like the cartoon figure spinning in air, and there's nothing underneath them. The ground for our submission has disappeared. And that's why, if you look on the back of that outline, there are, I think, roughly six logical relations we could imagine that we sustain towards the civil magistrate. And you will find, if you survey Christian literature, that all six, under some circumstances, have been justified by appeal to Romans 13. You say, how could you justify obedience and disobedience on the same passage, whether it's passive obedience or passive disobedience? How can you justify active obedience and active disobedience from the same passage? How could you justify secession, expatriation, rebellion on the same passage? And the answer is, Paul's theory is, since the magistrate is instituted by God for certain purposes, insofar as he does what he's instituted to do, we offer him the kinds of obedience that he requests. And when he does not do that, we do not owe him that, nor do we owe allegiance to him always. We could, in fact, expatriate and live in another nation. We could, as a civil entity, secede from his authority, as all the colonies now have. Australia is no longer a part of Great Britain, and Canada is no longer. 1954? We got out a little earlier, 1776. But the other colonies, one by one, have all sought their own independence. The southern states attempted to do the same, didn't succeed, but it was an old idea. People have been seceding for some time, even at gunpoint, in the case of the rebellion against Great Britain. And so all of those options, under certain historical circumstances, can be justified by the same text. But the only way you could do that, it seems to me, is if the imperative is grounded in something else. So that if the ground disappears, the imperative disappears also. But you will find learned Christian authors arguing on the basis of Romans 13 that we should obey actively or disobey actively this particular law, obey passively or disobey passively these particular laws, remain loyal or secede, remain loyal or expatriate, or actually even overthrow a government and put in place one that will do what God believes government ought to do. All of them could be justified on the basis of the same passage if Manton and Hodge and others have read the passage correctly. And I judge that they have read it correctly. I think that is the natural and appropriate way of understanding the fors and the therefores in this text, that there is a reason that we offer the submission to the magistrate. And if he violates the reason, then he violates our obligation. And so that means that the matter still remains open. So let me pause and see if you have questions about Romans 13 or about my abbreviated descriptions of the 6 kinds of relations. You understand there's an active obedience and passive obedience, active disobedience and passive disobedience. In the one we're doing something, and in the other we're not. So active obedience means to do what they ask you to do. Passive obedience is when they tell us not to do a thing, and we don't do it. We're passive, we're doing nothing. But since the thing is prohibited, we call that passive obedience. And the same would be true of active and passive disobedience and of other kinds of relations to the magistrate.
Do you take the position that the determination as to whether what the magistrate is doing is in the advancement of good, and so we're obligated to follow, or merely neutral so that it's a prudential matter? Is that a matter of individual conscience?
Yes. In most, the one would be different in terms of the list on the back. I think E and F, the latter two, cannot be merely individual. That is to say, secession is a corporate act of a group that intends to govern itself by some other way, as a rebellion would be. But I think in all the others, it is a private decision that we have to exercise. And then the question is,
does it matter what the justification is for a regime that imprisons people for being Christians?
No, it was the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1963.
Sure, but
so it was the fact that there were missiles in Cuba,
that was the
and then they were a puppet of the Soviet Union.
Sure.
And so their own stated principle, you're right, was not moral, but that we were abetting a real live military threat. Once the missiles were removed, then there was no more reason to cut off trade with Cuba than with other people who had human rights violations by our standards, whom we did not withdraw trade from.
And so you think the determination as to whether a particular country's human rights violations justify trade sanctions is something that is a matter of individual conscience?
Yes. However, remember, he doesn't bear the sword in vain. And so if you're willing to stand up against the government and run the risk of incarceration or fine, you have to realize the responsibility of that, right? It's a pretty significant responsibility. You're willing to say, I'm so confident that the government's reasoning on this point is wrong, that if they catch me and fine me or incarcerate me for it, I'm willing to accept that consequence. So you shouldn't do it lightly, right? You shouldn't do it lightly. But yes, I think it has to be the case that the individual has the decision of when is my obedience compelled or when it isn't. Otherwise, your alternative is Eichmann. And 95% of my students would be Eichmann. They have been reared to be compliant. And at his trial at Nuremberg, he said, I was not tasked with determining which Jews would serve in a factory, which Jews would serve agriculturally, or which ones would be gassed. I was tasked with getting them to their destination efficiently, and I fulfilled my task. He did not regard himself as being under any individual conscientious ground to raise those questions. And I think that that is far worse than an individual deciding otherwise and being willing to suffer the consequence.
Sure, but there we're talking about a situation where it's a leap of logic that doesn't flow from your premises.
Right. But what you have, if you think frog in the kettle, originally in the early 1930s, Hitler's trying to erect this massive, efficient industrial economy to recover from the First War. And so it starts with Eichmann and others like him complying with all sorts of things that are probably morally neutral. And they become part of this mechanism that continues to do this sort of a thing.
They had any obligation not to comply with things that were more neutral. They could have complied with all the things that were more neutral, completely consistent with the principle.
Right.
So that doesn't get them to sending Jews to the gas chamber.
No, but my point is, if you ask how could a human become an Eichmann, my answer is by the frog in the kettle. It probably became incrementally the kind of thing where the greater good is the industrial effort, the economy, these kinds of things, and then before long, they probably just stop raising the ethical question altogether. And this was the critique of Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse in the Frankfurt School in the 30s. Long before the invasion of Poland in 1938, they were already saying that the highest, most sophisticated technical industrial efficiency in the world is in Nazi Germany. And it is a system that does not permit you to throw wrenches into it. And they saw the potential problems of it even then, because it's a system where if you start raising questions, you slow the whole thing down. What's necessary is compliance. And so especially after the 20th century, at least I do not take lightly the notion of private consideration of whether our government's policies are just or not. So what I think most people would do in practice is they would say, I will comply with the government's neutral policies, but not with the government's policies that are morally evil.
And I guess right, and just going back, and I'm probably taking too much case by just kind of throwing that out in an offhanded kind of, but that's my sense. I could be wrong.
Yeah, I can see why you'd sense that. I don't think so, because I think that when I say that the individual conscience ultimately has to make these decisions, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be informed by Charles Hodge or Thomas Manton or whatever. That is to say, there's no reason to think that the individual stands there isolated like Bubble Boy intellectually. Certainly he ought to be familiar with the Western ethical heritage and these kinds of things. And I would think that in most cases you'd end up with probably a 90 or 95% consensus on those kinds of matters for those who raised the questions, right? So I don't think you'd end up with every single citizen having a slightly different answer than every other citizen. I think you'd find schools of thought developing on each of those important matters. And there would be people who thought the Bay of Pigs was a good idea, and those who thought it wasn't a good idea. The Cuban Missile Crisis was well handled or not well handled, but I don't think you had a million views on each of those. I think you had 2 or 3. So I think that's what you would actually end up in practice. But yeah, I simply think that humans at some point are responsible for their own behaviors and not the behaviors of others. And so it is at least permissible for them to raise the question of whether the government has the authority to require of them what it has done. And like I say, most people would not take my position. They might take it theoretically. So in practice, what I suggest is you must disobey when his commands command you to do what is wrong.
Sure.
You may disobey when his commandments are neutral. But I don't say you must disobey. I just do from time to time.
Right.
But, many people say, no, I'll play it on the safe side and fill out the paperwork. That sort of a thing.
Yeah, I mean, the dispute is there a must obey as to neutral matters? I mean, that's the nature of
Right.
the dispute.
Right. And all Hodge and Manton were saying is, no, there is no must that we must obey on neutral matters. On those, we may, if we choose, to forego obedience.
But the government's then not acting unjustly when they punish you.
No. Well, I mean, no, what they're doing there is they're acting unjustly when they require obedience to things that are not morally grounded. That they merely enforce it or not is sort of after the fact. So they step outside of their jurisdiction when they pass a law which they're not authorized to pass. And then if they merely enforce it, that's just gravy, it seems to me. But I think it's the stepping outside of its proper arena of authority that is the problem. You actually see it not so much in, it seems to me, domestic policy, but foreign policy. That the nature of the neoconservative movement, which has embraced apparently both Democrats and Republicans, is that all sorts of occasions for military intervention now appear to be just, including people who simply don't have a democratic form of government. So I think that's the much tougher one. If we don't raise questions about that, we will lose a substantial number of conscientious objectors. And I think conscientious objection in the military is a noble tradition, abused by some, but it's a noble enough tradition. There, I think the issue is acuter. It's a much acuter question because it's so hard to know the consequences of these things. Well, at the end of the day, is Iraq better off now than it was before Saddam Hussein was there? Are they any better now that he's dead than they were when he was alive? Do they have less deaths? Right? Those are very, very difficult questions to ask. We're just sort of used to the fact that if nations are unfriendly towards us, that military people can go and kill and be killed. But to me, that's a much acuter question than what kind of cigars we smoke as an afternoon pastime. So I think if we served in the arena of the military, we would especially have to raise the question, under what circumstances is one nation's military killing the sons of mothers justified?
Sure.
Because there was a time when it was fairly limited to defense, not to perceived national interest, but to national defense. And now that we apparently have a more flexible understanding of what may be in the best interests of the nation, we can use military power to do it. I would think service people today face enormously difficult questions of that nature. Because how did Basowich put it? He's got his book on American exceptionalism, but he's got that other one, Expressing on Military Power, that suggests, these adventures. I think adventure is somewhere in the title. That after the Reagan administration, we had a much more adventurous doctrine of military power than had been in the past. So those are the people who I think would raise the question most acutely. Possibly a few others serving. Police. Let's say the legislature here in Kansas passes an unjust law, and then you tell the police officers to enforce it. Very acute thing. When I was in New Hampshire, the example was they suspended one of the civil rights, the Bill of Rights. They passed a law, if a person is accused by anonymous tip of abusing his children, the Department of Children and Youth Services can take the child away until the parent's innocence is proven. So it violates innocent till proven guilty, violates the right of answering your accuser, and of course is destined for mischief. Bob gets fired, right? Unhappy with his boss, calls in anonymously, my boss is abusing his kids. They have the authority to take their children away for however long the trial process could return them. So I remember saying to one of my police officer friends when the law was passed, Jim, whatever you do, don't come to 10 Lake Avenue, right? Don't come to Ayer Street where we are. Because I know you're wearing Kevlar, and I'll shoot you in the head. I won't shoot you in the chest, right? And he says, don't worry, Dave. He says, I don't know a man on the force who would enforce those rules. We all have our own children, and it's an incredibly unjust law that a person's children can be taken away from him without a due process.
I guess just the last point would be on that it's being achieved by government, and as a matter of conscience, we should obey those laws.
Forgive me for smiling. I had written down road, which side of the road before you mentioned it, because that was going to be part of my answer. So the answer is in two parts. If there's a moral law that we want to have safe roads, in St. Thomas they can drive on the left-hand side. Here we run on the right-hand side. There, love for the safety of others and so forth says, while you could have chosen it either way, the point is once it's chosen, that's the only choice. But I appreciate you raising the question of good. I think in this context, good is juxtaposed to evil. And so it doesn't mean wise policy as opposed to less wise policy. I think the point is that he's supposed to reward good behavior in the moral sense and punish wicked behavior in the moral sense. The more general question of what promotes what we used to call the commonwealth, right, and those kinds of things like that, I don't think Paul is addressing those. I think that it's more in the question of when you have criminal law established to punish people for behavior that is ostensibly wicked when in fact it isn't wicked. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, there is a sense of the moral good or the common good or the commonwealth, which I think very few of us would exercise the judgment that we know which is better. Right? If we were originally here when horses became automobiles, at some point somebody had the deliberation right side or left side. And they probably flipped a coin, right? And the people from Missouri said, show me. They had to flip the coin 3 times. But at that point, I think we would say, well, who's to say that one of those is better than the others? And so I think you're right. In that arena, who would have the ability to know? Should you put fluoride in the drinking water and this kind of a thing? I mean, those are harder questions, it seems to me, to pursue. Mm-hmm.
And those laws are also followed pretty loosely if you live on Ward Parkway. So.
Yeah, a friend of mine in Grove City told me about 6 years ago that he gotten in trouble with the law recently, and he said, I managed to do one thing and get 2 tickets for it. And so I said, well, Eric, how'd you manage that? And he says, well, I was doing 95 on Interstate 80. I said, speeding ticket. Yeah, he says, and I was in the eastbound lane heading westbound. I said, yeah, well, that's a twofer, all right. And so Eric was in some serious trouble on that one. So, yeah, the interstate's always fun. The older gentleman went into town one day to get something from the store. His wife was watching the news, and she called him on the cell phone and said, are you on Interstate 43? He said, yes. She said, well, be careful. He said, why? She said, there's someone driving in the wrong direction on Interstate 43. He said, one, there's hundreds of them. So you do run into those kinds of things, as it were.
Sort of like Lance's point, this puts autonomy back on the individual, which is good to some degrees, the Eichmann example, but it also leaves the individual with sort of the ultimate choice, and that individual could be a Cain. But there's this kind of fairness element. I was thinking of another neutral one. When we lived in Scotland, if you want to watch TV, you have to pay £80 to the federal, or their version of the government, for the privilege of watching TV.
For the privilege of watching non-commercial television, I take it.
Mostly, yeah.
Right.
There is some commercial on, but it's for BBC One and 2. Well, lots of people don't like that, and Americans don't like that. This is ridiculous. And the temptation would be, of course, to try and skirt it. And they'll send helicopters and trucks drive along the road to see who's watching TV and where they pay. But at a kind of a fairness level, am I stealing from my neighbor who's paying because the government is funding BBC One and 2 to produce the thing I'm watching? I feel like I've gotten away with something because I'm not represented in the parliament, and who voted on this stupid bill anyway? I think we paid it. Yeah. We paid it.
Mr. Moderator, let the record show that the pastor
did pay it.
The pastor pays the fine.
But there could be so much autonomy in even these small matters, is following Lance's point, that order and fairness in the community begins to disintegrate.
Right. Well, as I suggest, Paul's indicating that there's a clear area where you obey, where he prohibits what is illicit and requires what is good. That he permits a category that is theoretically not like that, where one is not required to obey, does not mean that one should exercise the privilege frequently or lightly. It just says the category exists, and most Christian thinkers who've wrestled with the question have recognized, since Manton at least, that the category exists. And then the degree of personal angst or existential discomfort we have with it probably is more temperamental than anything else, right? Those of us who, I've always gotten a kick out of characters, for instance, and so I don't guess I've ever thought conformity or compliance is the highest of interesting human traits. Other people, like my wife, are much more cautious, and they're much more comfortable with people who are compliant than people like me. So I suspect we would find temperamental differences in the degree of comfort we have. But I think for Manton, all we really need, or that Westminster needed, was the recognition that not all of his requirements were to be obeyed. Remember that in the Catechism on the duties of the civil magistrate, it says, obedience to his just commandments. And they would not have added the adjective just if the possibility of another category existed.
Well, it's one more.
Lawful commands. They said law. Obedience to his lawful commands was the term they used.
This is a historical one that's important to everybody.
Yeah, well, two things. First, my standard line is a Virginian, because Virginians were involved in the Revolution. The Lee family was involved, in fact, were signers. And they were also involved in the Southern Secession. First, the paradox is armed rebellion is a more severe act than secession, and that if the one's justified, surely the latter should be. Yet I know almost no one who does not approve the rebellion against George III and yet disapprove of the Southern secession. I just don't know how that can be. I just don't know how that can be. I could see you disapproving both, approving both. I could see you disapproving the first and approving the latter. Then it's very, very difficult to follow the widespread approval of the armed rebellion against the person who had given us this land, protected us from the French, protected us from the Indians, right? The Southerners had not been helped by the North at all in any ostensible way, just wanted to withdraw from this voluntary agreement. It was like a Brexit, right? And so, first of all, there's the historical irony that 99 of 100 people in Kansas, New Jersey, Virginia, anywhere in the United States would probably approve the revolution against George III and disapprove the Southern secession, though secession is a milder act than rebellion. And the Southern states had not benefited by the military protection of the Northern states, the protecting of their tariffs and their navies and anything like this the way they had and so forth. So just historically, that's just an odd thing. And so when you move to the context of it, it seems to me both of them were fraught with difficulty. Neither was a no-brainer. The original concern was not really George III. The concern was the Parliament. But in the nature of how the British government balanced powers, the king could overrule Parliament. And so the reason Samuel Davies and others petitioned the king is they wanted him to whip Parliament into line, and he wouldn't. He was not willing to pay the political capital of bumping heads with the PMs and Parliament. So that's really where the issue was, Parliament. So no taxation without representation. They wanted representatives in Parliament. They felt the people on the other side of the Atlantic couldn't understand what the colony's concerns were and so forth. So yeah, it's a very complicated issue.
You could get an A in that class.
With either answer.
As long as you gave me a good answer.
Right. And that's the way I would propose it too. Though I would probably tweak it and say, try to defend the American armed rebellion against George III, who'd given us these lands and sent the ships over, protected us militarily for over a century and a half, and not defend the Southern secession. I might have pointed it a little bit to see if that would work, but I think in these border states it wouldn't be safe to do that. They jailed Reverend McPheeters in St. Louis because he baptized a child in the name of a Confederate general because his parents assigned that name to him. And so, his parents called him Robert E. Lee Smith or something like that, and he baptized him that way because the Constitution of the Presbyterian Church required it. And he was jailed in St. Louis for sedition and got on a train and appealed his case to Lincoln, who had no authority to overturn the case but offered him a pardon, and he wouldn't take it because a pardon implied guilt. So, the border states are funny states on these things. I think that I'm ambivalent about their reasoning. I still think probably what they should have done is entered into treaty and said, is not a colonial state analogous to a child who reaches maturity one day, and due to no disrespect, but just the opposite, respect to his parents for rearing him and protecting him during the time of minority, does he not reach a time in which he can stand independently on his own, nourished by all of the assistance prior to that? Could we not enter into a discussion for 20 to 30 to 40 years? Are we not nearing that point where an amicable dissolution of our current bonds would serve us both best, where we pledge our military defense of you to us, we perceive ourselves as common nations with an equal status to treat and to treat with other nations and so forth. To my knowledge, there was very little, if any, effort by the colonies to do this, and because in terms of political history, hotheads tend to triumph over the non-hotheads, just the nature, I guess, of the way it works. So I might have been much happier had they, as the result of a generation's efforts to have that conversation failed, that they then said, well, if we cannot leave amicably, I'm afraid we will have to leave not amicably, and then done it. So I think that might have been the better way to have done it. Because when Canada left, and I think when Australia left, they left amicably. Maybe because the Americans already had, and Great Britain knew you can't keep a colony once it wants to leave anyway. But I think they could have done the whole conversation differently. They started out well. You remember the initial preface, when in the course of human events, think of how evolutionary that statement is. It's not revolutionary. When in the course of human events. And so it seems to me that they began with a due consideration that a colony like a child eventually becomes mature and stands on its own feet out of no disrespect, but out of respect and gratitude to the parent. And so they started, that language was in there from time to time. But I think that once you got the 13 colonies together, it was the hotheads in certain colonies who were pushing for more immediate action. And then they simply had to make the best decision. New York held out longer than anybody. Aren't you a native? New York?
Yes.
Yeah. I think New York was the last to ratify. They took the longest time to ratify. I think Jay was not persuaded. So they eventually decided they didn't wish to be alone among the 12. Then on a very small vote in the legislative body or whoever was doing it in New York, they concurred.
So it's likely that probably as 35% of the people wanted to remain loyal to Britain. So even this idea of the congressional gathering, that was sort of arbitrary as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's messier than we probably ordinarily think it is. And it's just very easy as a Virginian to say, well, why was this so right and this so wrong? So we just have a peculiar point of view on the matter, I think. Mm-hmm.
Questions in regard to the more larger discussion we've been having about the extent of legitimacy of civil authority. But would you say that it seems to me in verse 3, Paul's language about if you do what is good, you will receive his approval. Does that underscore in your mind the whole point about the legitimacy and extent of civil authority? Because he sort of seems to assume here that if you do good, you'll get the approval of the magistrate.
Yeah, I think his assumption is that if he's a 4 by Genesis 9, that the whole point is civilization cannot make progress if we permit theft, crimes against persons, crimes against properties. And so that even people uninformed by the law of Moses or the teachings of the Beatitudes or anything like that will understand that they have to suppress cultural evil in their society, that they cannot permit crimes against persons or crimes against properties. And so I think his point would be, there's really no reason to think the government's going to bother you if you behave well. And you even see that all the way into the early fathers when there's been some outbreaks of persecution, smaller outbreaks of persecution here and there. They still seem to reason the same way. Because before the totalitarian state of the late 19th and 20th century, the government simply couldn't surveil you all day long like it does now and that sort of a thing. It really couldn't micromanage even if it had wanted to. It couldn't garnish your wages if you were a deadbeat dad. It couldn't take your taxes out before your employers gave them to them and that kind of a thing. It did not have the mechanism of things like telling a parent they have to fill out paperwork to tell them how they're rearing their kids. Had you sent it to a Roman governor, he'd say, "Are you kidding me? Don't bother me with that small potato stuff." Right? So not only would they not have made education compulsory, they certainly wouldn't have asked a parent to give an account to the state for how they rear their children. So we live in a very different moment where the government has the technologies to be much more intrusive in our affairs than it was. That's why the interesting thing is the equivalent now, of Samuel Adams and so forth are the hackers who threaten to take down various aspects of the federal government, or who do WikiLeaks and so forth. Oddly enough, sort of the spirit of that branch of patriotism are the people that says, we're going to take the very tools they're using that we judge to be unjust, and we're going to turn them on them. And so they're kind of the wild guys out there. They're the kind of the fringe end of the patriot movement that are threatening to unsettle the very tools that the government's been using to unsettle us. So they're kind of funny, that group.
Can't want to pay. Where does that fall in?
Yeah, some group or movement has to be the first to have a wide-scale act of passive disobedience. Where, I think they could have done it with compulsory education. An enormous amount of our taxes goes to support. This is such a horrible idea that we won't even call it what it is. We always call it public education. We have a public library in Grove City, I am not required by law to attend it, right? And so to call the educational system what we call a publicly funded library is just, and obviously recoiling from the horrible nature of it, that you're compelling 12 years of servitude to the state. We were all drafted, just not into the military. And so there were people who thought, even in the 1930s and so forth, that for the government not only to require this, but then to take money from us, from our taxes, to fund a system that shouldn't even exist, much less compel our attendance to it, they felt the same way. You could easily come up with probably a dozen such things. And somebody has to be the first one to float the trial balloon where they say with Albert Finney from the movie network, we're mad as you know what and we're not going to take it anymore. And so what they do is they do a massive, organized, 4 years from now, on the following April 15th, we are not going to pay but X% of our taxes, our federal taxes. And if you want to try to prosecute 85 million of us, go ahead, right? Or find some other way of saying, too much of what's going into this budget is for things which are not only morally neutral or borderline, but are immoral. And they can't prosecute but so many because you don't have enough prisons to hold them all. So at some point, some clever group will be the first to say, no, widespread passive civil disobedience would work because you can't prosecute everybody. I thought if even the homeschooling families in a given state said, as of next year, none of us are going to send in the paperwork. You're on your own. If you want to prosecute 4 million people in Kansas, go ahead. Because I think in Pennsylvania it is about 5 million. So it's a large enough number that the prosecutor's office will say, please, don't give us that, right? So I think that would be the better one, because if you refuse to pay taxes, they're going to take them out of your employment anyway. So they can find a way of garnishing those. But if you say, no, we're just not going to send the paperwork in, then the Commonwealth would have to say, do we want to tie up every prosecutor we have with 10,000 cases this year to prosecute that people didn't fill out paperwork? And then once people started flexing their muscle a little bit, they would continue to flex their muscle and find clever ways of saying, we don't mind being compliant citizens in most areas, but if you're requiring us to use the monies you take from us to do wicked things, at some point we have to say, we're just not free to do that. And that's the kind of conversation that we can do, and we are, at this point, permitted by law to do so. What we can't permit by law is to discuss the violent overthrow of the federal government. Passive noncompliance with it is, at this point, still permissible by law. Violent overthrow is not permissible. That's a federal crime. So, yeah, I think those are the conversations that people need to have. It's a classic frog in the kettle. The government just keeps doing more and more and more and more and more. It keeps encroaching more and more and more and more. This is the nature of the totalitarian government. And at some point we say, 10 years ago we should have put our foot down. But it isn't 10 years ago. And now what do we do? So, yeah, we've reached this unfortunate thing that the situation is nearly uncontrollable. And it's largely because to be reelected, you have to give portions of your constituency what they want. And that means you have to have income to do it. That's why marijuana will be legal in all the states within 4 years. It's a money winner in California and Oregon and Colorado. So whatever its merits, one way or the other, I'd still rather smoke Cubans. But whatever its merits, more and more governments will say, this was like pari-mutuel betting when only Nevada and New Jersey did it for years, and now everyone does it because it's a money winner. It's a revenue enhancer. And so they will continue to do that sort of a thing. So politicians just give, they cry. They're like the leech, according to the proverb. They give, and they just want more and more and more. And eventually people will say, well, we think we've had enough. But it needs to be coordinated. The Patriots were right on that. If we do not hang together, we will hang separately. And so they were aware that for passive civil disobedience to be effective, it has to be organized. Only Rosa Parks can be Rosa Parks once in a millennium. And after that, it has to be a little more organized. But God bless her, because she was courageous and she was right. Why should a tax-paying citizen not have access to public transportation the way other tax-paying citizens do. It's entirely unjust. It just doesn't make any sense. But for the most part, most of the rest of us will find that passive civil disobedience is best done with a coordinated effort. But that would be fun. One, the homeschool movement. Have them all refuse to turn in the paperwork. And just see if any of the prosecutors would waste their time prosecuting cases. They don't have time now. Their criminal load is too big. So they're all way too busy to prosecute cases like that. They wouldn't care.
Any other questions?
Well, thanks for your attention. I'm glad to give my rousing pro-government speech for you last night and today about how well the government treats government, the Scriptures treat government, and encourage us to expect that the rulers will not take things from us, or maybe they do just the opposite. But have fun wrestling with government and how we relate to it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.